I'm also a TA provider with ICF.
Awesome. So if we can go to the next slide, we'd love to get the chat going and hear from you all and we'll up your name, organization, or entity that you're representing, the area of Alaska you live in, however you define that, pronouns and other identities you'd like to share with us today. And then the check-in question is, what is your favorite time of year? First day of salmon season. Definitely an Alaska season. Summer.
I recently learned from Brian that you can't really schedule meetings during salmon season in Alaska.
When is the start of that?
June 1st for us.
Okay, so fun fact, when I first interacted with Alaska, I actually started in June and was sending out all these emails, like introducing myself and telling everybody who I was and how I was going to support, and didn't get anything for like the first month or 2 months and was like, are they ignoring me? And then realized it was June in Alaska and nobody's at their desk in June, in Alaska. So it took a couple months, but
yeah, I was going to say you can schedule meetings. You're just not going to get good attendance.
awesome. All right. Please feel free to continue using the chat today. We'd love to hear from you. We got some really good conversation going last week, and we hope to keep that going this week. So made some intentional shifts in kind of our content to be able to do some of that. So if we go on to our next slide, we are going to do our kind of group agreements. Before we get started, just level setting and grounding ourselves in that each time. So these didn't change from last week, but just wanting to bring them up again today. So be present, listen actively, and use I statements. Participate to the fullest of your ability. Our collective growth depends on the inclusion of every individual voice. The goal is not to agree, but rather to gain a deeper understanding. Choose courage and bravery over comfort. Challenge the way we have historically responded to homelessness, and see each of us in our collective growth as part of the solution. So we can go on to the next slide. We will go through our agenda. We're going to talk today about white dominant culture norms or white supremacy culture norms, white supremacy norms, depending on how you have heard them identified before. We will also talk about gatekeeping and then end with our learning into action. So with that, we have a couple of learning objectives. So by the end of this, we would hope that you can understand or do understand the basics of supremacy culture norms or white dominant culture norms, as I mentioned before. Recognize how those norms manifest within the homeless response system, and then identify ways to shift those norms through intentionally doing something different or identifying ways that we can implement or adopt different norms. So grounding, again, I think is the same as last week, but again, just wanting to ground ourselves in our grounding, understanding that when we talk about systemic oppression, it can feel like that we are discussing individual behavior or personality, because it does really condition our behaviors and personalities. But last week, as we talked about kind of the different levels or different types of racism, individual, interpersonal, systemic, institutional, we're really focused on the systemic and institutional, but recognizing that that is impacted by our interpersonal individual as well. We also acknowledge that it can be challenging to discuss these practices and have these conversations. And we encourage you to examine your personal reactions and seek conversation and support from your peers, from others, as you engage in these discussions, because we know that they're uncomfortable. So with that, we will shift to our white supremacy / dominant culture norms. So just an acknowledgement of where this material came from. This is built upon the work of Tima Oken, who wrote the original article on white supremacy culture back in 1999. So the link is there. It's also in our, I think, in our resources slide at the end, and we will make sure that these slides get out to you all. And Helen will send those out, so you have those resources. So white supremacy culture, we're going to talk about the white dominant culture norms in a moment, and you can kind of see them on this slide, but we're going to go through them a little bit on the next slide. I think in and of themselves are not necessarily bad. We're not saying that the white dominant culture norms in and of themselves are bad. I think it is when we assume that that is the way that we are functioning together as an organization, as a group, as a collective, without having an intentional conversation about them that makes them white dominant or makes them white supremacy and embedded into a white supremacy culture. So as it says on the slide here, you know, at the organization level or the institutional level, we often value these and use these as definitions of success without having any conversations. There's assumptions that are made about them and about that they are the right way or the good way to do things. And white supremacy culture is linked to other forms of oppression. So I don't know that we've actually stepped back and talked about why we lead with racial equity when we're also talking about equity as a whole. And we lead with racial equity because race intersects all of the other inequities that we talk about, especially in our work. So when we talk about people with disabling conditions experiencing disparities in our homeless response system, that is accurate and true. And when you layer or intersect race in with disabling conditions, there are even greater disparities that come into play. Same thing with sexual orientation, gender identity, household status. All of those intersectionalities of identity come into play, and that's why we lead with race. White supremacy culture also trains us to internalize. So going back to some of the conversation last week about implicit bias, it allows us or trains us to internalize the attitudes and behaviors that really actually don't serve any of us. And again, are made through assumptions that we're making about the way to do things. So if we go to the next slide, I think this more clearly shows the different white dominant culture norms. And we're actually going to pause here to have a discussion before we define them or go through them. And again, some of these are going to sound like, I mean, the first time I saw these, for example, I was like, well, I definitely can relate to some of these. And one of them I'll point out is like worship of the written word, right? Like we say, if we don't have it documented, then it didn't happen. Or if we don't write it down, then it's not legit. We say that a lot. And I think that in and of itself, writing things down, documenting things in and of itself isn't bad. It is when we assume that that is the way that we are going to do things without a discussion that makes it problematic. So that is just one of them that I wanted to name as like I can relate to this. Or having an agenda for meetings. I can relate to that because it helps organize my brain. Is that in and of itself bad? No. But if I'm assuming that other people that I'm working with are going to create an agenda and bring it to a meeting without having the discussion of the why, or a discussion of that's the expectation, then that means that it is an assumption that I'm making that isn't necessarily the right assumption to make. So we're going to pause on these norms here. The perfectionism, quantity over quality or progress is bigger, denial and defensiveness, the right to comfort or fear of conflict, paternalism, the one right way, urgency, objectivity, power hoarding, individualism, either or thinking, and the worship of the written word. And just see if anyone can or wants to speak up about any of these that feel like you have seen these in the homeless response system, like you've seen these in your own organization, and or identify which ones of these are the most problematic that you see impact the way in which we do work.
I think one of the ones that always jumps out to me the most has to do with prioritizing individualism over collectivistic values. And that's one I think we run into in Alaska an awful lot.
I've definitely heard the like rugged individual kind of term used in Alaska before. Is there something that you feel is more problematic than not related to that white dominant culture norm, Helen?
I'm not quite sure how to phrase it. It's just that the Western way of thinking that is very focused on the person and discounting the ways in which community and collectivistic culture and relationship is such a valid, I would even say more valid way of working within this universe where we're reaching out and helping others, as opposed to that whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps line of garbage.
You know, along those lines, I want to raise up the comment from the chat too. Sorry, I can't tell exactly who it is, but from choosing our roots, saying we heal in community, yet expect people to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. So very much in line with that.
And Michael, I don't know if you can easily go to the slide that kind of talks through the individualism norm. And we really, each slide, so each norm has an individual slide. We didn't necessarily want to take the time to go through every single one of these because that would be a 2-hour long conversation, and really wanted to make space for discussion, but wanted to highlight those that you all identify as highly problematic. And the individualism one really does speak to so the definition of failing to acknowledge the way that these dominant culture norms or dominant culture shape our norms, and that competition, that individual competition, is valued over collaboration, community, identifying community, capitalizing on, not capitalizing, but really supporting individuals through community. It also doesn't acknowledge systemic racism, seeks individual recognition and credit, and really is based on meritocracy. So the pulling yourself up by your bootstraps mentality and feeling like, well, you got yourself into this, you can get yourself out kind of thought. And within the homeless response system, really, it shows itself by that competition piece. And I guess I could say that coordinated entry and prioritization in and of itself speaks to this a little bit. And part of that is the limited resources that we have in the system to be able to support people experiencing homelessness. And that's kind of what we're forced to do and focus on right now, while also, if we can acknowledge that homelessness needs to be addressed at the systemic level. So kind of a both and approach, because right now here's where we're at, but we want to get to a bigger systemic solution.
Those 3 bullet points on that homeless response system are really, really speak to me. There are conversations I know that I've had with a variety of people about those specific things and how frustrating that is.
Mm-hmm. And then each slide does have a something different, some options or ways that we could do something different. So rather than focusing on individualism, rather than focusing on this idea that some people are more worthy of assistance than others, really pivoting to acknowledging our racist conditioning, acknowledging how there's racism, systemic racism built into our homeless response systems, valuing that teamwork and collaboration, and acknowledging all of the participants that we are trying to serve. Can you easily go back to the summary slide, Michael? See if other folks have thoughts and ones that stick out to them.
from my home community, one thing is the one right way. And we've lost a lot with that mind frame and that mindset that being Alaska Native, you're a heathen. You don't communicate the right way. And I've being Alaska Native and not quite looking Alaska Native, I get to receive that from people still today who have been handed that down through their life. And I think that's something that they really want to hold on to, that they can't let that go. And then you add other addictions into that on top of it. So that's my thought.
Really appreciate that, Tammy. And if we can go to that, there we go. Look at you, Michael, reading my mind. The idea that there's only one right way to do things and that there isn't value in looking at other cultures, methods, forms of communication. I think I heard you say, Tammy, as well. And that there really is only one right way to do this. I think the way it shows up in the homeless response system really resonates with me, continuing to fund programs that aren't effective, prescribing service through good or one size fits all, that all the meeting structures are the same. And I think with something different, really looking at different ways to do things, looking at different ways to communicate, looking at focusing on the fact or elevating the fact that the communities that are being served are the experts on what is going to best serve them, and really listening to that and highlighting that, prioritizing that. And I see some comments in the chat too. Individualism doesn't, going back to the individualism one, doesn't recognize or acknowledge socioeconomic, racial, inherent privileges, which creates one size fits all systems, which sustain other harmful norms, which is absolutely true. We have a whole session on targeted universalism that really acknowledges that people are starting from different starting points, and we're all trying to get to a specific outcome, and that to move folks to, in our case, I think permanent housing, they need different levels of supports to get them there. And then either or thinking limits the options for potential problem solving. Absolutely. I'm sure you've heard with the either or thinking, I'm sure you've heard it a lot. The like we say both and a lot now. I say that all the time. It's not either or, it's both and. I say that with my children. And I would say that within the homeless response system, especially, either or does oversimplify like very complicated systems, very complicated people that we are serving through those systems, and it's not effective. I might pick on pick on myself in this, the objectivity one. I think for a lot of reasons. I mean, data is my background, data is my SME, if you will, my subject matter expertise. And, you know, there's something to be said for quantitative data that really feels objective and feels very concrete. It's numbers, right? It's quantitative. But there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into the collection of that data, the entry of that data. There's just a lot of pieces in there that actually aren't objective at all. And even if you have the quantitative, that still needs to be supplemented by the qualitative. So because the quantitative is only going to ever tell you the what disparities exist, what problems exist, what does our system performance look like, but it's never going to tell you the why, which is why that qualitative is so important. And that is always subjective. Any others that want to highlight?
I will put up the urgency one because I will pick on myself since you were willing to do that too, Alyssa. That is one that I fall into sometimes and have to be wary of it and catch myself on it. But just thinking that we're trying to solve these important problems and there's no time to pause and think about everything else, just having to keep moving, like that sort of thing. So, in other words, not taking the time to be inclusive, as it says there, as intentionally as we would want to. So, yeah, expecting too much to work, unrealistic expectations, and thinking everything is urgent. Those are all things that I have to catch myself on sometimes. Then homelessness response, of course, as I mentioned, we're responding to homelessness. So it all does seem very, very urgent. But that is conflating need to act with urgency. And then funder timelines is also a big deal. We all know how that works. That dictates our work cycle. So yeah, different things to think about there. Priorities and timelines being set for sustainability and equity instead of more arbitrary things. Slowing down our processes to ensure inclusion and quality, and allocating adequate time to make sure we're completing tasks based on realistic expectations and thinking about how long it's really going to take for quality results.
In the
I-
chat, John asked, where would the term enabling fall?
I would say paternalism, but that is just my initial thought without hearing John's, if you had more context there with that.
John, feel free to come off mute.
I just did. I guess it stems from the frustration of both wanting to help somebody that needs help and then wanting to get more information to help somebody, but they feel they're entitled. That they deserve to get the help even though they haven't followed the process that's been put in place to be able to get them housed or help them get housed. It's something I battle quite a bit. When we did rent relief just recently, there was an expectation that we would be helping people pay their rent for up to a year, and they would be saving money and they would be helping themselves so that they could survive later on. And then at the end of the process, we find out that they hadn't done that, and they still feel that they're entitled to getting more money to help them with their housing when there are other people that need it more, that have been working hard to help themselves to get better. And so I get frustrated with the people with enabling. I felt that we were enabling people and they felt entitled to it. And I battle with that quite a bit. Does that make any sense?
It does. I don't know that that follows, I don't know that that would fall into a specific white dominant culture norm, but I think that part of that kind of goes back to individualism, because this is within the broader context of the world and the environment, the culture. I do think with the paternalism slide, there is this something different. The words that are sticking out to me here is authentic partnership, and maybe also elevating what Cami wrote in the chat feels a little similar to authentic partnership, like case management provided to support folks in learning important life skills, making sure that the work that we are doing is supporting folks in sustainability and self-sufficiency over time.
Yeah, what my battle is that the people that need the help don't get it because there are folks that are taking advantage of the system. And so I feel like we are enabling those folks that then take funding and assistance away from the people that really need it.
I think I would challenge if there is, you know, both quantitative and qualitative feedback to hear the where that's happening and why and or how and how often. Because I would say that's a very small percentage of folks that are using the system in that way. And I think that for those that are, it is a survival technique that they have been conditioned to learn and adopt because of the going back to white dominant culture norms, back to individualism and it's survival techniques. So I don't, yeah, that's kind of the thoughts that I have. Michael, I don't know if you have other thoughts or anybody for that matter on the call.
Yeah, I've been thinking through how to word my thoughts because it's a complex topic and I'm not exactly sure how to sum it up in a couple of sentences. Um, a lot of them are aligned with some of the things I'm seeing in the chat about like how services are provided and, you know, which households have access and what levels of access and things like that. And certainly there will be households that have access and may not take advantage of it. But that's not always the case. So, I think I'm trying to figure out how to create a comprehensive response, and I'm having a little bit of trouble with it. Um,
I had a guy deny moving into an apartment that is on one of our grants because he's only bringing in $300 after what his rent and other bills would be. So I thought that was really intriguing to me, that he would take time to actually look at what we can do for him, his life situation, and needing to walk away from it. To me, that's accountability to himself. And he may make too much money to get food stamps, but who knows if he actually tried. So he would rather stay homeless than move into a unit. Where I had another guy who didn't want to fill out the paperwork, he didn't want to do anything, and he was relying on his disability to be his excuse as to why he didn't want to fill out the new application because it has a 3-month time lapse, to give me updated information. And he got irate with me because I was denying him because he wasn't following through. I mean, I waited for over a month for this paperwork and I kept reaching out to him and there was just no follow through from him. So it's kind of like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
yeah, this is actually it's actually helping me consolidate the thought that I was having. Because I think we talk, a lot about client choice in our field, and it is what we want to see. And, along with choice comes the things that come after choices. So, I think that is a real thing.
And I'll just elevate what Cami wrote in the chat of, I feel like one of our roles within the homeless response system, and just like my background is coming from direct services, that is how I started in this field. So I know what you're speaking to. I remember that, and I remember how difficult that it can be at times, and also empowering clients, empowering people experiencing homelessness, giving them resources and skills, and helping them become self-sufficient. And Cami, to your point, that there will be people who aren't ready to show up. That doesn't speak anything of negatively of them. That just says this isn't where they're at right now. And we have to acknowledge that. And to Michael's point about client choice, that is when it's okay to say, you know what, we've done everything that we can. We've done everything that we can, and they're not ready for this yet. And that's okay. That's honoring client choice.
Yeah, I also think it comes, I like the word empowering in there, and I agree that what Cami put in the chat sort of helped me too. If you are empowering the people in your program and you're offering the access to what they would need to be successful and all of that, and then through their own choice, they don't take advantage. Yeah, I agree. That's maybe the time when you would think about referring, things like that, but making sure that all of that is available, and that it's not based on, some preconceived like program design or something like that. That's how I think you can steer away from some of these culture norms, and make sure that that it is happening in a way that is responsive to the client's actions and situation, basically.
So I'm actually going to have you go to the power hoarding slide. That is a white dominant culture norm that we didn't speak to in depth, but it leads into the gatekeeping. So for power hoarding, the definition that we have here is that power is seen as a limited resource. There's only one seat at the top, if you will, and suggesting that change is seen as a threat to that power. So change is hard, but there's like intentional and explicit pushback or barriers to change, even if positive and effective. There's no transparency in decision-making, and the leaders are assumed to be qualified and working in the best interest of the organization. And typically, especially within white dominant culture norms, predominantly white leadership. Within the homeless response system, we see this show up as elected officials setting the direction for the system without input from the people that system is impacting, that only executive directors participate in planning and preparation and strategy, that mainstream agencies are receiving the majority of the funding, so that it's not allocated to, more grassroots organizations or organizations that specialize in supporting specific subpopulations, and that persons with lived experience and expertise of homelessness who advocate for systemic change are excluded. And something different is power sharing. Power sharing, and also in order to power share effectively, initially doing some power mapping to really understand where does power sit today within your homeless response system, within your organizations, and how do you start to identify where that power sits and how to then share it. Developing transparent decision-making processes. That is something that HUD has really worked on over the last several years, I would say. The data standards process is one of those that they had made more transparent than ever during the fiscal year 2024 process. There are other ways in which HUD is really looking at developing transparency within their decision-making processes, having more inclusive leadership, having more inclusive working groups to help inform their decisions, including communities in decisions, ideas that are requested from others and are valued for the expertise that they represent. So looking at expertise beyond, I think, what we have historically thought of as expertise. I know that when we look at updating like job requisitions or posting job descriptions, that the minimum requirements don't necessarily speak to education or just education, or if there are different ways that you can provide expertise and experience beyond, that bachelor's degree or master's degree. Defining leadership as developing others, and then BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and other people of color leadership as something different. Any thoughts folks have on the power hoarding? Do you see this come up in the homeless response system or within your organization at all?
Alyssa, this is John. I see that homeless response system, what you had highlighted in there is something that I think is evident all over the place. Plays out in Anchorage all the time with the mayor and the assembly, what they're trying to do. So I think it's dead on with what I see going on right now.
Thanks for that, John.
This is Sherry, and it's interesting too, because I see that in Anchorage, certainly, but on the other hand, also when there's a requirement that elected officials get involved and they choose not to, that can be just as damaging, because you're just kind of stuck then. You have no way of advancing anything, and that's a powerful position to be in too. So it can be overplayed as well as underplayed.
In particular, I look at that second bullet, that only EDs participate in the planning. I think that's an element that I think our elected officials have a problem with. They get the people at the top rather than the people that are really being affected. I think if that were to change, then I think we see a better result.
I would 100% agree that not only I think that if it change, I know that when it changes, we see a different and better result. So I agree with that.
Yeah, there's a couple of things in the chat there too that I will just raise up. Holly's comment about power hoarding, sort of saying that it is very real, and that they kind of what we heard, that meeting, a lot of meetings and a lot of spaces do not have diverse representation. Then Cammie's comment of this is a good one too, seeing a lot of resources go to the same mainstream agencies, which harms smaller groups. Then when we request additional funding to be on par, sorry, my chat box is a little small there, to be on par with the other service agencies, some of them being national orgs. So like the big agencies with diversified funding streams, you got denied, which yeah, certainly allocation of the way funding is allocated can also, power hoarding can affect that for sure.
Michael, do we want to use this as a jumping off point to shift into gatekeeping?
Yeah, we can do that. Because gatekeeping is the next topic. We have chosen to make gatekeeping its own section here because we do see that it's very, very evident in a lot of homelessness response systems we have worked with. It is, it is in and of itself a white dominant culture norm. And it ties into the power hoarding one, as Alyssa mentioned. It's really a spinoff of that, but kind of touches on some of the other ones too, like paternalism comes to mind. But gatekeeping tends to be such a powerful one that we wanted to make it its own section here. So jumping into that, this is the context. Gatekeeping is really a form of control. And it's a process by which people who hold power limit access to information, resources, and other keys of success. When we're talking about this, it's important to remember that information is power. And even gatekeeping relationship is a form of control and power. So we're talking about limiting access, right? So you're controlling and usually limiting general access to something. That's keeping the gate. That means withholding information. So within the context of our work, that often includes information that we consider necessary to make informed, inclusive, and transparent decisions. So, one thing just from my experience in homeless services systems, I'll call back to on that point is how funding is distributed and the way that process works. That's something that I see in that one in my experience, but I would love to hear if anyone has thoughts on these as well. And then withholding power. That's ultimately what it ends up being about. Withholding decision making and power, right? That's often a very key aspect of gatekeeping. So that's one I want to point out pretty strongly. We have seen that in, I know, in multiple communities. When we do governance work and things like that, it's not uncommon to see gatekeeping as a form of withholding decision making power in one way or another. So that's a really important one. I'm going to keep going, but I also want to say, this is a pretty dense section and I don't want to just talk the entire time. So as I'm talking through this, please, anyone, if you want to raise your hand, put something in the chat and have conversation, please do. I would much prefer it that way. We'd like to talk to you. So yeah, be thinking about how this plays out in your community if you see it in different places. And let's have a conversation about it if you see anything that catches your attention. So when we think about like the role of the gatekeeper, how do we interrogate our role as gatekeepers? So agents of social control. I'm just going to kind of go through what it says here. Whether we intend it or not, we do serve as agents of social control, holding power over people in poor communities rather than always engaging with communities in ways that restore decision-making power and establish mutual accountability. So this ties back into including the people affected by what we're doing and decision-making and being transparent, right? When we control that access, then we're really exerting this kind of control and acting as a gatekeeper. And then in terms of being accountable to institutions, so although we intend to be accountable to populations that are most impacted, really what we're doing is being accountable to the institutions that pay us. So there's kind of, there is a tension there. There's a real tension there because you're getting your funding often from a federal funding source, it may be a state funding source, but those are the ones paying us, right? So we have real accountability to them. When in this line of work, you also want to be accountable, ideally, to the populations that you're giving these services to. But those institutions that pay you are also the ones that might give you credentials. They might evaluate you and ultimately decide, depending on your setup, whether to promote or fire you if it's the agency you work for. So, these are ways that this shows up when we think about how we are gatekeepers within the homelessness response system environment. Yeah, I'd invite anyone to comment if you have anything to say on those. Yeah, I don't want to just talk at you.
Can I jump in just briefly?
Yeah, go for it.
You know me, I have a hard time not talking. So what I would like to ask is that you maybe go a little bit deeper into the ways in which implicit bias interact with gatekeeping. So the fact that you have to actively work at bringing diversity into your decision-making process, because it might feel like you're not gatekeeping, but if you're just automatically going over and over again to the same people that look like you, in order to have them be a part of your organization and decision-making process, whether you mean to or not, that's a form of gatekeeping. So could you kind of expand a little on how that might play out in the real world?
I have an example, and Alyssa, I'd be curious if you have one or if anyone else has one too. I know when I was working in community, and this was several years ago when many communities were really only starting to get a little more serious about including people with lived experience. I think the way our organization went about that process was certainly impacted by implicit bias with, the people that we would consider to bring in as people with lived experience. There were probably more people interested in giving us feedback than I think my organization wanted to hear from. And I think that they were, without necessarily being intentional about it, being selective over who they invited into that space. And it was probably fueled by implicit bias. And that, of course, limits the range of opinions and the range of voices that contribute to the conversation, which ultimately, can play into how funding is distributed and things like that. So there's a really big ripple effect. But to your point, Helen, I think implicit bias certainly played into how that was approached. So that's a place where I've seen it show up. I'd love to hear if anyone else has an example.
Okay, I have one, I think. I mean, I was just gonna I think I'll acknowledge that as TA providers, we have the potential to be pretty significant gatekeepers. We have a lot of information and access to a lot of information. And I don't know that I really acknowledged that until I did, which was probably just a couple years ago now. And I think that for me, this is gonna sound really cheesy, but I always keep front and center in my head the like with great power comes great responsibility, right? And just being very aware and cognizant of my implicit biases in addition to the role that I that I have the potential to play as a gatekeeper. So Helen, to your point about like going to the same people to talk through the same things and not bringing in different perspectives, I would say that like we have a very large is, subjective, but we have a large homeless services team within ICF. And I think that we have folks that we know have specific skill sets. And also, as we have talked through different streams or lines of work, if you will, recognizing that when I'm talking about HMIS within our team, that there was a time when I would only go to a very specific number of people to have the conversation because I knew that they came from an HMIS lead background or some kind of data background, rather than looking more holistically at HMIS and data and how the perspective of YHDP, for example, or how the perspective of coordinated entry or our people with lived experience of homelessness could help inform those discussions. Yes, about data, but from a very different perspective. And it always made a difference. And it always brought in perspectives that I would have never brought in because that's not my experience. That's not the expertise that I'm bringing. So it's implicit bias from the like, I know what your skill set is, so I'm going to rely on you because you're a data SME, expanding upon that and realizing like, that's not the only experience that we need to bring in when we're having conversations about anything, but specifically in this example, like data.
This could be a good opportunity, as I know we're getting, time is getting short quickly. So this could be a good opportunity to move on to this one too. Just to show some ways that gatekeeping shows up, which might also spur some other thoughts for comment. But this is the conflict. Being agents of transformation can be exhausting, but that goes back to the beginning. So if we just slow down a little, right, I'm sorry. I am not doing a good job with my notes today. I apologize. I'm going to switch gears a little. So what you see there on the screen, the disconnection between our role and our liberated gatekeeping potential, right? So we have this role as the gatekeeper, and our potential to be a liberated gatekeeper. So being mostly performative about racial equity by not committing to actions that will move money, share power, and lead to concrete solutions. That kind of plays to the example I think that I gave about the way we engage people with lived experience. It was a very similar thing there, because we weren't committing to those real authentic actions. So that's a way that it shows up for sure. Not engaging in open sharing about professional mistakes and harm that we in our organizations have caused, with the focus on changed action. and lack of awareness of who's most impacted by the decisions we make, and authentic engagement with people who need to be involved. That also ties back, I think, to that example I gave, and it's also one of the strongest points here, in my opinion. That's something we talk about a lot now in the field is authentic engagement, and it's incredibly important. But it's also easy to fall into the role of gatekeeper in that space, I think. So I really just want to point that one out. So we have discussion topics, but I also know we're getting kind of short on time. So these are maybe some things to think about at least, as we're wrapping up. So what are the dynamics of professionalism and gatekeeping that keep you or your organization stuck in perpetuating institutional and structural racism? What would liberated gatekeeping look like for you and your organization? So how could you recognize the role as gatekeeper that might exist and how to utilize that in a liberated way that actually makes positive change? And then what are some immediate steps you can take to do something different? All of those slides we showed earlier had information about something different, but they are not. The something different there is not the end all be all and authoritative thing. There are things you can do to do something different as well if it's different than that, right? So that's what we would encourage you to think about. So that kind of plays into our learning into action section. So let's go through that really quickly. What can you do next besides thinking about those things I just put there? So identify one particularly problematic white dominant culture norm within your own organization that you would like to focus on to do something different. Identify one that you personally adhere to. So, being a little more introspective. So one that you adhere to whatever degree, and then figure out how it benefits you while also potentially causing harm to yourself and others. So kind of why do you adhere to it and what harm can that cause? And determine the power you have within your position and what steps you might take to become a liberated gatekeeper. So again, that goes back to, what is your role as a gatekeeper and how can you use that in a positive way? That is the end of the slides, but I did want to make sure we had a few minutes, so I moved kind of fast there at the end. But yeah, want to open it up for questions or discussion on any of that we just went through.
This is Sherry. I just wanted to ask, I know that you said that you were going to be sending out slides. Is that after everything is finished? Are you doing it after, because I haven't got any of like the first one we saw, the part 1 last week.
Yeah, that's my fault. I'm going to send them to Helen. It is my fault you haven't gotten the first one yet because I think there was a link in there that we needed to correct and I needed to follow up with Alyssa. Sorry about that. But I will send these to Helen kind of as we do them. And then Helen can distribute.
It's great information. It's helpful to have the slides because you can kind of go back and then think about things a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely.
We will be posting links to the slides and the videos probably on a page on the website. But we will set everything up for distribution so you can go back and review. And I'm going to shoot to have last week's and this week's up by the middle of next week.
Thank you. I kind of like that we're getting to the down and dirty of why we're getting such an influx of homeless people and how we might be able to readjust our views to help. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, in the vein of not being gatekeeping, we will share that next week's session is actually going to be on power analysis. So really digging into who does and does not have power and how, how we could potentially shift that around. So that's what we'll be talking about.
Okay. Excellent. I think it's about time. Look at that, 2:59. We are right on it. Thank you everyone for joining. We look forward to seeing you next week. Let me know if you have any questions between now and then. Have a great sunny Wednesday.
Thank you. Take care.
So everyone.
Thank you. Helen,
Tammy,
are you free for a quick chat?
can you give me 10 minutes?
Sure, you want to just call me?
I'll call you.
Perfect.
Sounds good. Thanks. Bye.